And I think we are live. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever time zone it is where you're watching this, whenever you're watching this. Welcome to Deploy Friday with Platform SH. My name is Larry Garfield. I'll be your host today. Joined today by Chad Carlson from our developer relations team here at Platform SH. Say hi, Chad.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
And we are also joined by two wonderful guests today to talk about e-learning and tools, strategies, techniques, and so forth therein. So I don't know where this is going to go. Hopefully, this will be an example of learning remotely using the E because stuff. Yes. With that out of the way, I'll stop talking and hand it over to our guests. First up is Olivia Lidde. Olivia, give us an introduction. Who are you? What are you doing here?
My name is Olivia Lidde. I'm a technical curriculum developer at Amazon Web Services. In my role, I develop training curriculum for people who are looking to pass our AWS certifications. And prior to that, I have a lot of experience with teaching kids, doing technical training for adults. And so where I am in my career now is really helping people figure out how to bring these two pieces together. How do you take the best of learning theory and instructional strategies and combine that with some of the innovations that are happening today with technology?
Cool. And we're also joined by James Aparaicio. Am I getting that right?
Yes, hi. It's
Hello.
James Aparaicio. So
tell us a bit about you and your e-learning background.
We're based in Switzerland, so I work at ConnectEye. So we're a development company, and we developed Opigno, and it's a learning management system. And yeah.
Okay. So let's get right down to it. Olivia, you've taught in person, you've taught remote, you've done training materials. What would you say is the biggest pitfall of e-learning that for someone not used to some kind of e-learning system? But what's the biggest thing to watch out for, either from the learner side or the teacher side?
Yeah, I'll start from the teacher side. I think one of the biggest pitfalls is trying to start with technology first instead of figuring out and identifying from the outset what are your set learning outcomes and goals. Like, regardless of if you're using technology or not, by the end of this instruction, what should your learners be able to do? What new skills should they have? And then once you have those outcomes, you should work backwards from there and figure out the strategies to implement that'll support that instruction. And I think that if you go into it with the approach of, if I had zero technology at all for these outcomes, how would I teach that? What would I do? And then I think it becomes a lot easier to layer in effective technology that can truly support that, instead of what I've seen in many cases, which is people who are in a teaching capacity who decide, hey, I've heard of these 10 new tools. I'm going to put all of them in a course together and let's see what happens. And then from the learner side, it gets very confusing. It becomes very jumbled. And then what's difficult for learners is that not only are they having to learn the new content and skills, but they're also having to navigate through the technology. And it's just not a great experience.
So wait, just to be clear here, you're saying that e-learning doesn't mean you don't have to worry about all the same stuff you do in any other kind of teaching? It doesn't just solve those problems for you? That's what I've been doing wrong all this time.
I know. You weren't on the E or whatever you said earlier that had me cracking up. Yeah. Yeah. And that is quite a surprise for many people, because I think sometimes when e-learning is presented as a quick fix, a quick solution, it's a little scary, because you especially really need to return to those foundational strategies of working backwards, identifying those outcomes, and then ensuring that throughout the instructional process, you're continuing to check in with learners and keep them engaged. Make sure they're understanding before you throw 5, 7, 10 different concepts at them.
So that it sounds like it's harder then, because you have all of the normal teaching stuff you have to do, and then all the technology on top of it that doesn't take away any of the normal teaching bits. So aside from
Right.
the obvious of, oh, I can do it from across the continent, why would you do e-learning of any kind? Whatever the tooling is, if there's so much more work, why bother?
Yeah, and that's where it really gets into the question of what are you really hoping your outcomes will be? And I think for some companies that are embracing e-learning, they're seeing that they need to shift to an e-learning mode for consistency across their training offerings, so that instead of having many different people, different trainers presenting a session, they're able to have more of a consistent voice with it. And also, it can be a lot more scalable in that regard. That whereas in previous models, you might have been able to only work with smaller groups, e-learning you can do thousands upon thousands at a time. So that is a good benefit of it. And also, really being able to leverage some of these other technology tools that you can bring in when done well, when done with intention. And so, if you really are hoping to give learners a more interactive experience and help them to have more engagement, e-learning really does offer that capability.
And how does that differ depending on like the age group you're working with? I understand that, it's commonly said the way that adults learn new things and the way children learn new things and the way adolescents learn new things are completely different. The brain works differently enough that the teaching strategies are different, and that's even in person. When you're dealing
Hmm.
with e-learning, what other things do you have to think about there, depending on if you're doing content for adults versus teens versus, I don't think it works for 3-year-olds, even though we keep trying to do it in the current pandemic.
Yeah.
Like that part aside, because we know that doesn't work, but what
Hmm.
other differences are there from an e-learning perspective for um, adults versus non-adults?
Yeah, so with adult learning, something that's really important to keep in mind is that adults really need to know why they're learning something. They need to have that rationale behind it before they're given a new concept to embrace and do something with. And that's why with adult learning, especially in a digital context, you want to try to take more of a task-oriented approach to it. So rather than just giving someone a lecture and saying, here's your new knowledge, go do something with it, adult learning really benefits from being able to present content in ways that is specifically targeted to skills that the learners need to do. And also, too, with adults being, well, older than little, I'm imagining a 3-year-old on Zoom trying to learn how to code or something. Um,
People are
but
trying to do that these days.
they are.
It's a challenge. A
It
friend of
is.
mine, is a preschool teacher and has been trying to do remote Zoom-based circle time with 3-year-olds, and
Ooh.
she makes it work as well as it can be made to work, but it's just not how that's supposed to happen.
Right. And you also need to bring in learners' prior experiences, because that's really where you get into this great happy place of connection, where if you are able to have learning connect to what learners have already done previously in their careers and where you want them to go after this learning has occurred and tie that to the new strategies, that's where you can have this training, this instruction that you get a lot of buy-in because the learners understand why it is that they're there. One other thing I'll mention too with adult learning and also in the context of e-learning is that compared to kids, like I'm thinking my middle schoolers who had no problem in telling Miss Liddell that this lesson was not meeting their standards, a lot of adult learners can tend to have self-doubt when it comes to learning new things. And they can sometimes feel this pressure that they should be understanding a concept better or more quickly than they actually are. And so when you're designing instructional strategies, especially in a digital context, when you can't just stop by someone's desk and ask, hey, how's it going? You want to tailor in these ways to check in and make sure that you're giving them the support to almost do some self troubleshooting and see, okay, I as a learner am stuck. How do I recognize that I'm stuck? And what can I do to get unstuck so I can continue learning?
I think you need those channels. I know when I was a TA in grad school, the tool that we were using, James, I don't know if you're familiar with Blackboard, but at that point, 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't really a community equivalent of you being in a classroom and having other people trying to learn the same thing and being stuck with the accessibility of somebody who could be sensitive to you being stuck and being that outreach point. We have the advantage of it being kind of a supplement to our courses. But in terms of replacement, like you really need that additional aspect of it for that kind of check-in.
Yeah, agreed. And I know sometimes learning management systems can be used just like you said, like just the add-on. But it's great to see that now a lot of companies are starting to embrace this model of all of our instruction and the communication is occurring within this single environment.
Does it influence like the sorry, Larry, I just does it influence like you're going in with a certain instructional strategy and there's these great things that LMS technology can add to it. I mean, I work a lot on a certification system that we have for some of our partners. And the way that we've kind of been guided by the technology that we have is you break a certification into a couple video courses that includes a section of quizzes to mark their progress. There's not a whole lot of feedback. And there's this continual pull that I feel of how effective is the restriction of quizzes that are kind of placed by the technology on the way the course is structured. I don't know if you can, if you've seen that where it's kind of like you have these limitations or you have a feature that kind of maybe goes against the instructional strategy you may have set out for in the first place.
Yeah, and this is where I'll say I'm glad that the approach I take with developing curriculum is that I'm still a learner myself, and I'm still reflecting on, well, how do I learn? What are my pitfalls? And I know from what I've seen with some LMSs that might have, like you're saying, these quizzes, they'll give you an answer, and then you think, okay, well, I didn't know that, let's move on. Or maybe the next level of that is the quiz will give you the explanation as to why this answer choice was correct and why the other ones were incorrect, which is still a little bit better. But then I think for people who are developing curriculum, it's so important to be mindful of the fact that the technology, no matter how great it is, it's not going to replace the responsibility of the learner to kind of meet the technology where it is. So for instance, if I see that there's an LMS that gives me a quiz with these really elaborate answer explanations, I can either look at that and think, oh, okay, cool. Or I can pause as a learner and think, all right, well, why is it that I didn't understand these pieces here? I really did not understand this part about firewalls. So that lets me know I have to go back and revisit that. So it's the other part I layer in here is that as you're teaching the learners the new content, there's also an element of trying to teach them how to learn within that LMS and utilize the resources that are available to them. Does that answer that for you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I certainly makes me want to take a second look at the way that we provide feedback to not just explanations, but to kind of encourage that follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, because that
goes to the general question with, tests in general, whether they're e-learning or not. Is their goal to assess, or is their goal an interactive reteaching mechanism? And depending on which one you're trying to do, you're going to write the test differently. And that's true whether it's a paper test or an online quiz.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's unfortunate because I know in grad school and undergraduate, any sort of online course that I took within that structured system definitely seemed like more of an assessment than it did to motivate me to maybe seek out a further explanation of where my thinking was wrong.
Yeah, because
we're talking about So we're talking about these tools now and the, how you design the quizzes or how you archive the material and so on. So let's turn that over to you, James. Opigno is an LMS system, a learning management system. Did I say LMS, learning management system? Is that like a PIN number? So Opigno is an LMS, a learning management system. And how do you approach when you're designing Opigno? Tell us a bit about Opigno, and how do you approach some of these questions of, giving people immediate feedback versus late feedback, or letting the student be self-teaching and so on?
So we, of course, have the traditional quizzes to assess a student. And inside those quizzes, we provide feedback as well. So the typical use, like just discussed, that if the user responded incorrectly, it says it's not correct because of this, and explains to the users. But in Opigno, we offer blended learning. So we have a learning path concept. So in a learning path, you can not only have lessons, modules, quizzes, but as well in-house meetings and as well as live meetings. So in Opigno, you can easily build your learning paths with both live meetings and even in-house training.
Okay. So that actually dovetails to another question, which I think is the live e-learning like we're doing here, or pre-canned e-learning, whether it's text or video or whatever, just something you've made once and can then distribute. So Opigno supports both, you're saying?
Yes. So in terms of packaged content, we support quizzes made in the platform with our own an editor inside the platform. So it's H5P technology, and we also support SCORM. So it's a e-learning standard, and as well as TinCan, the XAPI that can use LRS.
Okay, that was a lot of industry technical terms I'm not familiar with. So break that down a bit for me. So you're saying with Opigno, I can set up a course and tie that into a remote e-learning system as well? And so it becomes kind of a multi-headed setup, or is it like a standard for the content itself?
Yes, I was talking about how the content can be created. Because with SCORM or TinCan, you use a different software, Adobe Captivate, for example, and you build those course modules. So they are industry standards that you can share, use the same content in different platforms.
Okay.
So those normally require an external software to build. But on the platform itself, we have H5P, so a lot of different libraries that directly on the platform you can create all the content.
Okay.
So this is the options for the typical questions, responses, video, and all of that. But then, as part of the learning path, we also have in-house trainings. So it's where you set up an actual meeting taking place somewhere, and you can record who was there, assign scores as well. And then another option is live meetings. So we have a partnership currently with Moxtra for the live meetings, but we have integrated with other systems in the past.
Okay. So a lot of options, it sounds like. Do you have a sense of what's getting used most? Like, are people composing mostly in Opigno and sometimes in third-party system? Are most of your customers building in third-party system and importing their lessons? Do you have a sense of that?
It really depends on the client. I would say that some of them prefer how easy it is to create the content on everything on the same platform. But then we have other users that are used to these external content software creation methods and prefer to use that method.
Okay. So we have a few questions from the audience, which is great. If you have other questions, please put them in the chat on YouTube, and we will get to them here on the show. Marco says, just wanted to say thanks a lot, Olivia, for sharing all the wisdom. Amen to that.
Oh, thank you, Marco. Glad to be here.
And Matthias asks a great question here. One of the universities nearby did online exams. Turned out the students decided to distribute the answers. University decided to invalidate all the test results. how do you prevent online cheating? Valid question. It's hard enough in person. How do you do that when it's remote?
Yeah, there was one situation that happened a few jobs ago that I was called in for, where there was a faculty member at a university who was wondering what was going on with the student's discussion board that she had submitted to the LMS. The student was saying that her work was there and that the system just kind of broke it, that it wasn't there anymore, and she wanted to get credit. And
Computer
right
ate my
away,
homework.
right. The computer ate my homework. And right away, I started to think something seems a little bit fishy. So I had to put on my hacker hat and think, if I wanted to cheat, how would I go about doing it? And also, how would I cover my tracks? And I was able to figure out that the student had submitted a Photoshop screenshot of these discussion boards, but she had made some mistakes in the timestamps where she put in an extra space where it shouldn't have been and forgot to put a space in another part. Like, you should have just done the work to begin with. So I think that with online cheating, it's very rampant nowadays. From what I've been hearing, with even at the high school level, I heard some stories of people cheating on advanced placement exams. And so the recommendation I would have would be, if you are trying to prevent that, and you don't necessarily want to have to go the route of what many certification exams do with remote proctoring, like having someone connected to, like, through the webcam and being monitored the whole time, I would really encourage you to design assessments that aren't just multiple choice. Really create assessments that can still assess the intended outcomes, but require the learners to do something like an applied project that doesn't have just a list of answers. It does take more effort from the teacher side, but it can help to prevent the cheating and also give students probably a more meaningful experience with the content.
Are there cases where you... Oh, sorry, go ahead, James.
I was saying that on the Opigno side, on our platform, we have both these cases. So we can have questions that are evaluated immediately, and we can also as well have have questions that are reviewed afterwards by a teacher, and that as well to verify the identity. And we have worked in the project that we use the webcam to verify. So it takes a picture of the user to verify the identity, and while he's doing that's a specific part of the exam, verifies that it's the person that's there.
I've taken some certifications myself at certification testing centers where they do that. You've got a dedicated computer that's screen capturing and has a camera and drop of blood for verification and all of that fun stuff.
Yep.
So are there cases where it's not worth trying to stop someone from cheating? I'm thinking in terms of, like, if it's a graded system, then yes. But for example, if you're doing an onboarding training of some kind for new employees, is it worth trying to prevent cheating? Or is that, given the context, is that not effort well spent?
Yeah, like it really comes down to, like, what are you hoping that they get out of it? Is it, like you said, something that they're being graded on, or something that's more so you have to just check the box and verify that you did it? And yeah, and really trying to remember what you want that overall learner experience to be. Because if you come into it with the approach of wanting to maintain academic integrity and making sure that learners understand that you're putting these safeguards in place for that reason, then learners will look at that and think, oh, okay, now I get why you structured it in this way. But I've also seen where, if you as the instructional designer put too much emphasis on, hey, we know that you all are going to cheat, so, or you may cheat, so here's all these things that we've done to make it so that you don't do that. Oh, and by the way, you're going to be learning about this. Then you see what I'm saying? Like it kind of makes the learner focus more on the system instead of, well, what am I here to actually take away with?
So the same kind of challenge with, too much security to the point that the system becomes unusable. Sounds like the same kind of problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So one thing we've kind of danced around, we're talking about e-learning. What does that actually mean? What qualifies as e-learning? Like, is giving a remote lecture e-learning? Is a blog post e-learning? Is an ebook e-learning? Is, you know, what kind of tools and mechanisms qualify as e-learning? I mean, is there a difference between publishing an educational book and publishing an educational ebook and an educational website, all of which are kind of monodirectional? Does it have to be
Yeah.
interactive for it to be e-learning? You know, what are those? What does that space look like?
Yeah, to keep it to generalize it a bit so that people can walk away with some good buckets to sort things into. The three general categories I usually like to speak about are synchronous, asynchronous, and then a hybrid, and that combines a little bit of synchronous and async. So starting with synchronous, that would be like live instructor-led training, thinking about a time when you and your team members have to complete a training webinar, and you go there and you log on all at the same time, and the instruction is led live right then. That's synchronous. Thinking about synchronous, some of the benefits are that you can really bring in a lot of people together at the same time across time zones. It doesn't have to be the case that you're only offering it to this group at this time. It really can scale a lot more effectively. But some of the drawbacks of synchronous real-time training and instruction in e-learning can be when you as the instructor are trying to assess learners' understanding of the new concepts. So for example, if let's say I'm working on a module right now in a training course that has to do with networking security, and I'm just going to go firewalls again because firewalls are fun.
Cool.
So yay. So if I'm trying to ensure that learners have truly understood these concepts about firewalls and that they know how to set up and configure a firewall, I might not be able to really do that in synchronous training because there's just one of me and possibly hundreds of students who may all have varying questions, and I might not have the time in real time to pause and check in with each of them at that level. So you might be able to do like a surface level checking for understanding, like asking them what's the difference between a firewall and a router, but you wouldn't be able to like step aside and troubleshoot one-on-one with someone and say, hey, I see that you're having some difficulty with these, the configuration rules. Let's work on that, just the two of us. So that's where you may want to consider asynchronous training as another option. And asynchronous training is where this is more self-paced. You are able to present all of the same content to learners, but in a modality that's not requiring them to all be together online at the same time. So thinking again about firewalls, I might decide to create a training module that's broken into different sections based on topics. I might layer in some things like periodic knowledge checks, interactive videos, links to blog posts and ebooks like Larry was talking about. There could even be other elements in the LMS like discussion boards that are part of this. So you are able to have your learners interact and engage, but they don't have to be there at the same time. So benefits of asynchronous, it's that especially for learners who may struggle with grasping more technical concepts, they have more time to be able to work on that at their own pace. They don't have to feel lost and left behind like in a live training session. But some of the drawbacks, if you're thinking about all those things that I just listed, like discussion boards, videos, and quizzes, that takes a lot of time to set up and do well. I mean, you can do it quickly, but I guarantee it probably won't be as effective as learners need. So you could also consider a hybrid approach and take a little bit of sync and async depending on your needs. But those are the general basics of those.
Okay, and which one is best is again one of those, it depends on context questions, unfortunately.
Yeah, it really all does depend on the context. And I think that, like I'll give you a good example of synchronous training that I had in a previous job in my career, one company that I was traveling to train on, like spreadsheets. I was talking with a department head, and he mentioned to me that this one department, they were very tight knit, very close knit, like family. They've been working together for like 10 years. I'd never seen anything like it in all the companies I'd trained throughout my career. And I thought, okay, they just like each other. That's fine. But he wasn't kidding. Like they saw this training session that I was giving to them like a party. And I knew that even if I had done this in a webinar format and I had implemented some of these interactive elements so that they could talk with each other or kind of paying ideas off of each other, that still would have carried over there, because for them, what mattered was being able to have a shared experience of learning together at the same time. So it's like knowing the people that you're training. Other groups that I've trained, they're like, I don't, it doesn't matter to me if my coworker did the training at the same time. That doesn't matter for me. So I would say really know your learners and identify if there are certain use cases like this, then that can help you go one way or the other so that you're best supporting them for what they need.
Okay. Changing gears a bit. So we talked a bit about the tools and the LMS tooling, and there's a lot on the market. Some of it open source, some of it proprietary, some of it free, some of it extraordinarily expensive, some of it good, some of it bad. James, tell us a bit more about Opigno specifically, and what's its main differentiator? If I'm looking for an LMS system of some kind, either to host real-time or asynchronous versus asynchronous e-learning, why should I be looking at Opigno in particular? What makes it special?
I think people should be looking at Opigno because, first of all, it's a great product and it's open source. So there are no fees, no license fees involved. So even if you are a one-person company or a big company or a big or small school, there are no license fees involved. So it's based on Drupal. So there's a huge community behind it for contrib modules. So it's very easy to extend. And because of that, I think it's a very good solution.
So you say it's a Drupal distribution. In my experience, some Drupal distributions are kind of lightweight extensions to Drupal, and so are still very extensible the way Drupal itself is. Others are very, very customized and pre-built, and the fact that it's Drupal is kind of incidental. And then that makes them, extending them the way you would a normal Drupal site very difficult. Where does Opigno fall on that scale? Is it, still obviously Drupal just with some stuff pre-configured, or is it a custom application that happens to have Drupal under the hood or somewhere in the middle?
It's completely extendable with the default Drupal modules. So it uses the Drupal entity API, so everything are Drupal entity, so it's completely extendable and customizable.
Okay, so it's still,
we use
my Drupal knowledge carries over.
Exactly. So we use the most supported and active modules, and we built upon them, but it's very easy to extend and to customize.
Okay. And we have a question from the audience here. Pidinoto, I'm probably butchering your handle there, I apologize, asks, do you have any examples of async training to review? I'm going to broaden that a little. What are some really good examples of asynchronous training done well?
I saw that question. I was thinking, I've gone through so many different async trainings that just did not hit the mark for me. I set a really high bar, but there's one. I won't go too deep into the subject matter of it. It was a religious thing, so that's not the point of what this is. But just to give you a sense of what their LMS looked like. it was set up into different modules where you had a mixture of videos, some text to read, and some interactive like drag and drop elements. But what I really loved about this, and that I would encourage all of you who are following along to look for in async trainings, it had periodic places where you could pause and do like a journal reflection. So instead of saying you finish this module, click on to the next one, you could write, and it didn't even have to be a long thing, just maybe a paragraph in response to a question. And then once you hit save that, you have the option to keep that journal reflection private within just your account on the site, or you could publish it to the forum to see other people's responses too. So that kind of getting back to that question about how you prevent cheating, not that I was planning on cheating then, but there were some questions where I thought, oh, I don't really know how I feel about this. I wonder what other people have said first, but the site wouldn't let me do that. It's like, no, Olivia,
Yep.
you can't look until you've
I have
done
to
your
form my own opinions. What are you doing to me?
You're making me work. What is this? So, yeah, that would probably be one of the best examples, and that's something that I've really tried to incorporate into the curriculum that I develop, giving learners more time to pause and reflect, because it does keep the learning process moving forward within the learner, even though you're not at the point of giving them newer concepts. It's like, let it marinate a little bit.
I like that. I don't think I've seen that feature in other courses that I've taken. Do you remember if the snippets, if you chose to keep them private, do they become compiled into a journal for the whole module or for all of the courses that you took? Like that seems almost like you're kind of self-generating your own notes.
Right. And, this is where I have to admit that I didn't finish the course. I was wondering about that too. And this is often the case with so many online courses. You have that momentum in the beginning and then you're like, I'm just not going to finish. But I am curious about that, because that is something where I hope that they do have that feature. Otherwise, you'd have to go back throughout like 10 or something modules to click and copy and paste. But even if they aren't there just yet, I thought this is something that I have not seen in any other online course I've taken. And I really hope that more async courses will try to incorporate that.
So the best way I've learned is when I've taken the moment to do, even just for myself in my notebook, some kind of recap note. But you do bring up something I definitely made a note of something I've observed in myself with online courses, is the frequency of drop off. I mean, is there anything that you can kind of do, whether, like I said, in my case, I'm trying to encourage people, partners or even internal people who are kind of using the same resources for onboarding, to kind of dissuade that drop off that kind of naturally happens? Is it all inside the content itself and the way it's designed, or providing a kind of feature like this pause and reflection? I mean, is there anything that you've observed that really is a kind of an antidote for that?
Yeah, and it does come back to the pause and reflection. That's something I've had to add in as my own personal structure and support. Like when I've prepared for certification exams, like with a few months ago, I passed my solutions architect associate exam, and that was fun. But preparing for that and getting to some of the stumbling blocks, I realized like it would be so easy for me to give up on this, because I'm having to sit down and do this every single day. And so I decided that after every section, even for the content that I felt that I knew really well, and I could assume that I didn't really need to think that much about it, I would spend just maybe 10, 15 minutes writing down my notes and restating things in my own words. And that's where a lot of aha moments occurred, because I realized in some places that I truly didn't understand the concepts as well as I thought that I had. But then also, I was able to look back over time at some of the earlier journal entries that I made and realize that my initial understanding and the way that I wrote about concepts was very surface level compared to later on, where I was able to connect the dots a lot more. And once I noticed that, that became part of my motivation to keep going, because like I'm doing all this great stuff and I don't want to lose that momentum. So that would be something I'd recommend. If you don't have that reflection support, create it for yourself and use that as a way to keep going in the course.
Yeah.
James, is that a feature that Opigno has, or is that a feature request now?
Or the notes?
Yeah, it's like the reflective notes as you go through.
Yes, it's a very good idea. Currently, we don't have that implemented out of the
All right,
box.
so we can
Thank you
expect to
very
see that
much.
in the next
Yay.
version.
I love the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know I've read of a lot of textbooks or technology educational books that have questions for reflection or self-quiz or things like that at the end. This sounds like a more evolved version of that same concept. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think it's something that it's often missing because even in async courses where I've seen questions listed as like reflect here, there's not always the actual box. Because let me tell you, when I was going through that course and I saw reflection questions, I thought, oh, that's nice. Let me click on forward. And then I
Yeah,
saw that
and
there's a
I've always
text
done the
box.
same.
Yeah, because it's so easy to skip over that. And it goes back to the idea that as a learner, sometimes you assume that you understand something way better than you actually do because the content is still so fresh. But if you have to restate it in your own words, if you have to go through a scenario like a what if you change the firewall to do this, then you're not just you're going beyond taking in the knowledge and you're really starting to get to a higher level of thinking to apply it to a different scenario.
Yeah. I know
That's why
you
I
and
could
I have
really,
talked about before, you don't really understand the topic until you can teach it. And even if you're teaching it to a web form, you're still teaching it in some sense.
Yeah,
that's why
absolutely.
I could really see the benefit of the make it public feature of that, of try to explain it to yourself as if you were trying to teach it, and then see a bunch of other people trying to do the same thing to maybe catch that moment of, oh, I really wasn't putting the pieces together early on, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's
Yeah,
so much that you can do for with interactivity when you're trying to think of ways to make this content more engaging for learners. Like just yesterday, I was hitting a stumbling block with the content I'm developing now on network access control lists and packets to try to illustrate that. And somehow I got onto this thing where I had, before I knew it, I was giving them speech bubbles, and now I've got a talking packet, and it's going on an adventure. But it works, and it was just it's one of these strategies where it may not work for everything, but depending on the content, you can encourage learners to say like, hey, if these two components were having a conversation with each other, what would they say? What would that be like? Yeah.
yeah. That anthropomorphic approach, it seems kitschy, but it works sometimes. Yeah,
I
I
think
had
it's like the structure of a story. I think that can't help but resonate with people in a certain way, just that we kind of beg for stories in some ways.
Yeah,
yeah,
it really
there was
does.
a
And
time years ago I was debugging an issue on a site I was working on with a colleague, and there's some really weird back and forth going on between two systems, and we were doing some complex RSS synchronization and so on. And to understand what was going on, we just sat there with each other and actually did handshakes to represent the different steps of the process as a way to rubber duck what was going on. And a way to capture that experience in an e-learning tool, that sounds like that's a huge advantage over a more traditional book or ebook, where it's a lot harder to have that interactivity and that step through it yourself process that really helps to follow a concept. So that I like that idea. Yeah.
another idea that kind of adds on to that I always keep in my back pocket when I'm trying to bring this kind of interactivity into a synchronous training is to use a word cloud. And there's a lot of different websites that you can use out there for that can suit your needs. The one that I usually use is called Answer Garden, where you as the owner of this cloud can set up the cloud area, and then you give all of your audience participants the link to it. And from their side, they go in and respond with a word or phrase that explains their thoughts about something. So a good way to have some engagement at the beginning of a course might be to say, um, input a word that describes how you feel about topic XYZ. And as a trainer, I might see people who say, It makes them feel frustrated. It makes them feel confused. It makes them feel very anxious. That's good feedback for me to know for how to pivot. And then at the end of the training, I'll put up another word cloud that has the same question. How do you now feel about topic XYZ? And if I see that the responses have shifted even just a little bit, it's a good way for me to get that feedback that's not necessarily tied to a survey, but also makes it engaging for the learner so that they can see, hey, I'm not the only person who feels this way, or wow, I didn't realize that there are these other thoughts about it too.
I really like that, especially if you're showing it as part of a synchronous course.
Yeah.
That sounds like it can also help combat imposter syndrome for the people coming in at the start of, oh, everyone says they're confused by firewalls or TCP/IP or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also just, I think something else I would layer in with this, with any kind of instruction, but especially with e-learning, where there's the element of technology that some people feel a little bit hesitant about. It's always so helpful to humanize yourself to learners and establish that trust, but toe the balance, because when I'm a trainer and I'm teaching people concepts, I'll say, hey, I used to be a beginner too. I also was at the point of not knowing anything, but now I know how to teach it. But what you don't want to do is go too far to the other side where you say, hey, I don't know anything about this either. Let's learn. And then they're like,
That
oh,
instills
goodness.
so much confidence.
Right?
Yeah.
So, balance.
So another thing that e-learning allows for, if you're doing a traditional in-person class, then it's essentially linear. The teacher's talking about something in the order they're talking about. I recently published an ebook myself, and ebooks are linear, and you go through things in the order that the author decides to go in, and that may make sense, it may not. When you're dealing with e-learning, you have the ability to do multiple learning paths, branching paths, go off on a tangent and come back in on your own time. What are the pitfalls of doing that? It sounds cool, but are there trade-offs to having that less directed approach where users can, go all the way down the TCP rabbit hole before even talking about IP, or go all the way down the Cisco firewall before they start talking about general concepts, or whatever the multi-path logic is. What are the differences in that approach that let you leverage that capability without getting lost? And this is to both of you, I suppose.
Yeah. James, do you want to take that one first, or I can jump in?
Yes. So in Opigno, we have the possibility to have a customized learning path based on several things. So first of all, the score. So for example, if you have a given score lower than 50, we can send a user through one place, and if the user has more, we can send them the other place. Then we can do the same thing with the skill system. So the content that will show up for the user depends on the skills that he has gained and the ones that he doesn't. And then we can have specific branches based on specific responses that the user gives as well. So I think it's an important feature to have.
So that's the system controlling the pathway depending on what the user is doing, like letting them skip over a chapter or giving them a remedial chapter, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you also have the option for them to afterwards to see all the other content, the other path that they didn't go through.
So as someone who plays a lot of RPG games that don't let you go back and look at the other paths without having to go back and change a save game, thank you. Knowing what the other paths are without having to redo everything is very nice. So do you have the ability for users to then choose their own adventure in a sense as well, and go down paths in different orders or different times? Or is it just, the system is set up to control based on your score, you're going to go left or right here?
Yeah, I mean, we can do some kind of interest-based system based on the interest of the user.
Okay.
So we gather information initially, and then we can, based on their interests, recommend different paths. Yeah?
Okay. Which then creates a challenge, and I think, Olivia, this is to you, for the trainer or whoever's preparing the course, that you then need to make sure the content works out of order.
Right.
So you can't do the linear, do A and then build on A to get B, build on B to get C. If users can skip around more, how do you make sure that they're prepared for a given section, or avoid repeating stuff in every section? How's the educational setup process different when you have that branching ability, either that you control or that the learner controls?
Yeah, so there would for the instructor, you have to make sure that you yourself have a really good bird's eye view of the whole landscape of the course and identify all as many as possible interconnecting points that may make sense or may be a little bit more confusing for learners. And I think that what I would probably recommend in terms of branching and going on custom paths would be to try to put them into sub chunks or subsections. So if it's the case that you have to understand concept A before you go to concept G, then work on concept A first as its own little mini journey, and then make that part of G so that the learners can understand, well, okay, I'm on this path and I'm mainly going to focus on these other things, but I need to make sure that I do this other content first. And as the instructor, it's also a really great practice to ensure that you're not trying to force the content to be branchable when it's really not. Like I'm thinking about when I was teaching middle school Arabic here in Chicago Public Schools. And for something like a language, I know that there are so many of my students who wanted to jump ahead to the really exciting topics when we were getting into the part about food, because middle schoolers love food. But
they're eating a lot of it.
Yeah, they ate so much. I always had snacks in my classroom, but they wanted to get into the concepts about food when they hadn't yet learned the basics of the alphabet. And so I was able to meet them halfway and say, let me see which aspects of this food unit I can bring in here. We're not going to skip over the alphabet because you need that as a foundation, but that's another instructional approach that you can take to see, giving a preview of it so that you're not fully separating it, but you're making it more engaging for your learners.
So I hate to speak in gamifying terms, but it sounds almost like you're saying, make lessons unlockable, like a level is unlockable. Once you've reached level 4, you've completed lesson number 4, then this branch unlocks and this branch unlocks and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And Marco in the channel just asked to Olivia, how relevant is gamification in the context of e-learning? Excellent timing, Marco.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Marco. I think it's very relevant as an option to include. And knowing why you may want to include gamification in any kind of e-learning, understand that gamification and badging will be the main thing that motivates some of your learners, but totally not for another group. I know some people go into it and think badges everywhere, this is what motivates people. But then the subset of your population who's motivated by just being able to understand the new skills at a higher, at a deeper technical level, that's their motivation. So I think that if you're able to use the badging in a way that connects it outside of the LMS, that's ideal, especially for any new skills that are indicative of new tools that they're going to have to be able to use in their day-to-day work. So when I was working with some companies in previous jobs, we would set up the kind of system where you could you earn your badge for these different applications, and then you display a certificate by your desk so that if any of your other colleagues need help with certain applications, they can go around and see not only that this badge is digital, but it's there actually in the workplace. And so now with everything with the pandemic, I'm sure there's ways to replicate that possibly within internal company systems. But I would say it's important for some people, not for others, but whatever you do, when possible, try to take that badging outside of the LMS so that you can do something practical with it.
Make the badges mean something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on
That's good
Opigno,
advice.
we have both certificates and badges as well. And we have used as well Mozilla Open Badges to also push to other systems like LinkedIn and stuff like that as well.
You can push them to LinkedIn. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you couldn't when the last time I was playing with Mozilla badges, but that was a very long time ago. So that's it. That's a whole other conversation, I suppose. Okay. So we are closing in on time. We've got a couple minutes left. Those in the audience, if you have any further questions, go ahead and ask them now. Otherwise, are there any closing thoughts anyone has on e-learning with or without pandemics?
I would say, first of all, thank you again to Platform SH. I can't talk. Platform SH for having me here today to speak about this. And my best recommendation for any of you who are following along and hoping to improve your instructional strategies, remember that you need to continue to be a learner yourself, because I think that it's only through that process of seeing what it feels like to learn that you can take away some lessons learned and really be able to apply that to your own strategies.
I actually have one more question I just thought of that I'll throw out as a closing then. Unless, James, do you want to do a capstone yourself?
Yes, I wanted to thank you guys for inviting me, and for anyone interested in creating a learning management system to take a look at Opigno. So you can go to opigno.org, drupal.org, or you can create in one click on platform.sh their own Opigno platform and take a look.
We have a link. We have a link to the Opigno template for platform in the show notes on YouTube. So whenever you're seeing this, go ahead and click that link, and there's a button right there to spin up an instance of Opigno. So I'll close with one last question. What type of content should you just not bother doing through e-learning? Just say, I'm teaching topic X or subject X. It's got to be done in person. I'm not going to bother trying to do an online workshop or online course. This has to be in person.
Why did you save that question for the very end? That's okay.
I'm just cruel like that.
You are cruel. Okay. There's, without getting into specific, there's so many specific concepts and topics out there, but I think as a general best practice, what I've seen is if you have certain topics that you need to teach to an audience that is involved with some kind of major change within an organization, that let's say the whole organization is shifting to a new technology tool, there's new policies that have to go along with that. There may be some resistance or pushback to that internally. This is getting into change management, but I feel that it's not going to be effective to just say a one and done, watch this webinar recording and poof, all of the great changes will be made. That's it can be done in an e-learning context, but especially if you're giving instruction that is related to some kind of change that may be difficult for your users, you want to ensure that you layer that in some kind of hybrid approach with communications, check-ins, and possibly even live synchronous town hall sessions to ensure that people have been heard.
Yeah, that's definitely one that I've seen. Culture change happens in person.
Yeah.
So that's a good one to call out. I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. This video will be available on YouTube indefinitely, so watch it, share it around, give Opigno a try. It's a nice system and it is completely open source, so you have all those wonderful free software benefits with that. I want to thank you, Olivia and James, for joining us today. Thank you, Chad, for being here with me. And I think that will call it a day. So I will close the session here in just a moment. Everyone
Thanks
can say
everyone for
goodbye while I
joining
get the
us.
browser to load.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you. You finished it?